You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine.
Welcome to Necropolis. This is a very special episode. One, because I think it's the first episode that Jason will not be attending. So you'll have me as the host today, Shelley. And the reason he's not attending is because, in his own words, he doesn't want to talk about pizza thrash. If you could see the albums we have before us, obviously that was Jason being a little bit trite. But yeah, it's not his scene today, so he's decided to bow out. But to compensate for that, we do have the return of Joseph April, who will be joining us today to discuss some of these. So great to have you back, Joseph.
Thank you, Shelley. Hi, everyone out there. And apologies dealing with a cold, so might be a little gravelly.
No worries. Your voice actually sounds pretty smooth to me. So, and Tyler, who was also dealing with a bit of a sore throat because he was watching Sabbath yesterday. So, yeah, good to have you on, Tyler.
Yeah, no problem. That was actually Friday night, but yeah, did a lot of screaming at the concert, so my voice is a little shredded, but try my best to be nice and clear for you guys.
Good stuff. Okay, so yeah, it's a bit of an odd one today. We just decided to pick like thrash, speed, heavy metal albums, basically not extreme metal, so not death metal, black metal, which is our usual wheelhouse. So we've all submitted 5 albums. Raphael was going to join as well, but unfortunately he has another commitment, but he's still submitted some albums as well, so if we get time we're going to discuss them. So the list, obviously, there's quite a diverse list, so we're not going to be making direct comparisons between most of them, although some of them are of a very similar kind of ilk. But yeah, that's why the album picks look a little bit random today. But we'll just hop straight into it with Tyler's first pick. So I'll hand over to Tyler to introduce his first pick, which is Cryptic Slaughter, Convicted.
Yeah, Cryptic Slaughter, Convicted. One of my favorite albums. I'm a really big fan of this strange micro-genre, I suppose you could call it. Some people refer to it as crossover, although the albums I picked are kind of almost pre-crossover, I suppose you could say. Albums from these bands before they started incorporating more thrash metal riffs or speed metal riffs or whatever you want to call it. Cryptic Slaughter, especially on this album, I think falls into that camp. They have a lot more of the hardcore punk influence going on. But even on this album by Cryptic Slaughter, you can begin to hear a certain form of extremity, really flowing riffs that I think actually were a big influence on the burgeoning death metal scene that was to come, especially in Swedish death metal. But also in the American death metal scene as well. Cryptic Slaughter on this album has a really awesome sense, and in some ways this applies to all of the thrash albums that I picked almost, of stripping down the music to be just a stream of melody almost. Also, this album is very angry. Cryptic Slaughter is a pretty angry band. But yeah, this album is a classic in my opinion. I still listen to it quite regularly. There's a lot of really memorable riffs on this song, despite the fact that on this album, despite the fact that the album can almost sound just like a stream of really raw pendulum-picked power chords. You have songs like Low Life that has that really catchy tom beat with the riff that kind of follows around with the rhythm of it at the beginning. Yeah, I think that Cryptic Slaughter really kind of almost innovated a style of riffing on this album that you hear carried on and developed further with some proto-death and black metal bands like Slayer, for instance. And we're also kind of moving forward further that kind of style of riffing, that flowing drone melody style of riffing that you also hear pioneered perhaps a little earlier, if I'm not mistaken, by an album we're going to be discussing later. I think it was one of Shelley's picks, Discharge. So yeah, Shelley, I don't know if you have any kind of comments on Convicted by Cryptic Slaughter, but I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, it's kind of like the like very, very, as you mentioned, very, very angry album, but it's like the very, very ugly cousin of the D.R.I. album dealing with it, in that there are some similarities there, but Cryptic Slaughter's way more feral, way more like almost unpredictable in a way, because you will get some sort of plodding moments where they build to something, but then they'll just burst into like a cacophony of like percussive punches. And yeah, as you mentioned, you can clearly hear that on like the proto death metal of the time. When I was re-listening to it, I was drawing comparisons with the very sort of extreme thrash metal bands like Sadus and yeah, obviously Slayer as well, Sepultura to some extent. So yeah, you kind of, it's sort of a punk band playing proto death metal almost is kind of how it presents itself. And yeah, you really do get the sense that 86, very important year. There's lots going on in terms of like just people pushing the boundaries, but really kind of exploring how metal and punk can interact and collide with each other and antagonize each other. But also, yeah, out of it you get these really oddball kind of moments. And yeah, it doesn't really sound like many other thrash crossover albums in that sense. It does stand apart. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. I mean, where would you rank it, Tyler?
I think I would rank it at it's well, I guess I have a question. Are we ranking these in the context of these albums, or are we ranking these in the context of all of the music we enjoy?
um, well, as I said in the introduction, it's probably not fair to compare some of them because they're not really that similar. So I guess in the context of all music.
Okay, in that case, I would probably put it at about an A. I will say, as a quick aside, before we have Joseph give his comments on it, that it's cool that you mentioned Sepultura as a comparison you drew, because as we all know, I am a huge fanboy of Morbid Visions, and I think that's a neat comparison to draw. That hearing some of their influence in Sepultura. Also wanted to mention that you do hear basically some of the earliest uses of what could be called a blast beat on this album, talking about its influence on death metal to come.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, so Joseph, what are your thoughts on this?
Unfortunately, there's probably about 3 albums looking out of the whole list that I'm not the most super familiar with. I know I've listened to Cryptic Slaughter before, and unfortunately, leading up to this, I forgot to give it a fresh listen. But I mean, from what I remember, going along with what all you guys said, I know this is like a legendary album in terms of that crossover, hardcore punk, like burgeoning on thrash metal scene. So certainly, anyone who's interested in the beginnings and roots of the genre, like, I know this is an important album for that. I am aware that I think Napalm Death have covered them a number of times, so I think certainly in the history of that band, Cryptic Slaughter was a very important band, and I know other death metal bands have covered them as well, so certainly a band that, if you're looking for the roots of, extreme metal, that's an album you're going to want to pick up.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. We didn't mention, like, the fact that this basically led directly into grindcore as well. And, I mean, they're all of the same stock, I guess. They're all sort of coming at it from the same angles and drawing on the same influences, because at the time there wasn't that much of this music around, so they were all sort of drawing on the same source, but drawing very different, like, conclusions from it. So, yeah, in terms of ranking, I think I tend to agree with Tyler in terms of an A, so I'm just going to whack it up there. Unfortunately, we can't do, what is it, like in-betweeny rankings on this, because it won't let me because I'm using the tier list maker, but we'll just...
Yeah, it's it'll be interesting how this goes because I'm looking at my album selections and I would fight very ferociously for any of them being lower than an A. And since these are our favorites, I kind of feel like we're all going to be doing that to a certain extent.
To some extent, yeah. Unless we move on to Raphael's, where I'll have some comments.
Yeah, I was about to say the same. Don't worry, Joseph. Just about every album on this list, except for, sorry, Raphael, some of Raphael's picks are albums I really like. So I think that you'll be all right with arguing for their place.
Well, that being said, I have some comments on your next choice, Tyler. Corrosion of Conformity. So maybe you want to just discuss that one. Eye for an Eye was Tyler's pick.
Yeah, this will be fun then. So do you want extreme, blasty, thrashy crossover, but with some Black Sabbath riffs? Because that's what you're going to get with Corrosion of Conformity on Eye for an Eye. I'm a really big fan of this album as well. I think that I don't quite like it as much as Convicted by Cryptic Slaughter, but that's just by comparison. It is another thrash album that I listen to quite often. They have, just like all of the thrash albums, the big thing that I enjoy, the draw to it for me is the sort of stripping down the music to a flow of melody and their talent for sculpting melody. But with the addition of those kind of doomy Sabbath riffs, which was also maybe a portent of bad things to come for this band much later in their career, that you kind of get these awesome conflicts between that doomy sense of riffing and the blasting, flowing kind of power chord thrash riffing, which really kind of conveys this sense of, and this could perhaps be said of many of thrash bands of the time, of extreme sense of social alienation, which definitely I think lines up with some of the subject matter of the album. So yeah, Eye for an Eye is really awesome example, once again, of this early thrash scene. Like I said, this album with Corrosion of Conformity is kind of from that period of the thrash scene that was before it perhaps fully developed into what we call crossover proper, when many of these bands were writing still short form, hardcore punk influenced songs structurally, but later on began to use much more obvious thrash metal or speed metal riffs. All of these bands began doing that a little later on, especially Corrosion of Conformity and D.R.I. But here you get this really awesome, dirty kind of, in some ways, like Black Sabbath and Motorhead influence kind of contrast between riffs. You also hear that a bit in the sort of gruff Motorhead influence kind of in the vocals. So yeah, for this album, I would... it's really difficult for me to decide on whether put it at an A or a B, but I would probably lean towards... I would actually probably lean towards an A. I'm going to have to do that because of how often I listen to the album. I would almost put it at a B. But Shelley, how do you feel about Eye for an Eye?
Well, yeah. I've not listened to it for about 10 years before you submitted it. And it's not as bad as I remember, because I don't think I was expecting it to be quite as sloppy as it actually is. And it's one of these oddball albums, a bit like Neurosis's debut as well, in that they just obviously went in a completely different direction quite quickly after that into the sort of sludge and doomy kind of style, which again I didn't really get on with. But this feels like a band that's again sort of like a punk band playing heavy metal in a lot of ways. And there are moments across the album, as you mentioned, that kind of where they do seem to kind of get a grip of themselves and play something quite coherent and actually quite compelling at times in terms of that apocalyptic kind of feel that you only really get from 80s extreme punk, where it has that sense of urgency, that sense of like finality to it, but it is mixed within some very, very sloppy kind of playing. Not that that's a detriment in itself, but it does feel like they're not quite in control of what they're doing, especially in the vocal department as well. And there's just, aspects of that kind of take me out of the moment. I guess you're more of a purist in this regard, Tyler, than me, because um, I sort of sometimes struggle to see past its flaws in terms of like the sloppy playing and the production and sort of writing that doesn't quite make sense to me. But I'd still say like it's not nearly as bad as people say. It is kind of dismissed in the Corrosion of Conformity discography because, like I said, it's very different to where they went. And I think a lot of fans of the later style come to this and just get a bit confused because it's not even very slick, even by sort of hardcore punk standards. So yeah, I have to credit it for being a curiosity, if nothing else. But I think I would probably put it as a B as well. Yeah, Joseph, what are your thoughts?
Again, this is one of the ones that I feel like I'm on repeat, but I swear it's only 3 of these that I'm not as super familiar with. A lot of the later Corrosion Conformity is definitely kind of more my wheelhouse. Even that earlier era, before Pepper kind of took over the band and definitely let it more sludgy, Sabbathy. Although clearly it was there already from the beginning with Sabbath. But yeah, even for the early days, Animosity or Blind are the albums I kind of pull up more often. But, I certainly can respect someone who would say this is the best of the early era, because it is definitely, I think, probably the most primal and feral of the albums from that time period. I do think, just compared to a lot of the rest of the band discography, this is not the album I pull up the most.
Animosity is awesome, so I'll give you that one.
Cool.
So, where are you thinking, like a B?
Yeah, I think, honestly, looking at all of Tyler's choices, I mean, they're all solid. I think this is the most B-leaning one compared to the others.
Okay. I'm going to stick it in a B. Can you live with that, Tyler?
I can, yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, so no such qualms about this next album. D.R.I, Dealing With It. Tyler, do you want to introduce this one?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you feel the same way, because this album is probably the best one out of my picks, in my opinion. And out of this style and this period of crossover or thrash or whatever you want to call it, I feel like this may be about the best entry. D.R.I definitely has a lot of similarities in some ways with the other picks in this style that I chose, and with other bands and from this era, with the flowing, very furious and abrupt power chord riffing. But where they kind of move forward from those bands is they really have an awesome sense of kind of narrative composition, and with incorporating a much wider variety of technique to almost create a theatrical sense of song construction based around the topic of the piece. Whether you have Nursing Home Blues or Give My Taxes Back, and other pieces of that nature, Couch Slouch, you really have this kind of idea that the song should sound like the kind of essence or meaning of what the song is about. And D.R.I kind of, I feel, excel at that on this album. Really, I think, a necessary album almost for understanding how this kind of narrative theatrical sense of song construction was developed further by heavy metal from this point forward, in thrash metal, in death metal, in black metal. Obviously, D.R.I was an explicitly mentioned huge influence on Slayer, which obviously was one of the foundational bands for the development of death metal. So yeah, I personally would give this album an S ranking. But Shelley, how do you feel about Dealing With It by D.R.I?
Yeah, it's one of the first albums of this style that I encountered, and it's still remarkable to me to this day because I've listened to it a lot over the years. It still has surprises. It still has new elements to it that come out when you re-listen to it, whether it's a guitar solo that you didn't quite peg before, or as you say, like those more complex songs as you get towards the end of the album, Nursing Home Balloons and Argument Then War and things like that, where they really do. I mean, they're very simple. It's not, prog rock or anything. It's still in the sort of punk family tree, but it is very, very intelligent the way it's constructed, and it's surprising how diverse it is as well. You do get those like really short, really simple, just punch in the face punk numbers, but you do also get some longer tracks or tracks that feel quite long, even though they are very compact. Where they do just draw out quite a diverse array of ideas across the riff craft. The lyrics, obviously, are very kind of, what's the word, earnest, because they're obviously very young at the time, and they're quite sort of heartfelt lyrics at times. But it really comes across that sense of sort of passion and desperation and urgency. So yeah, that combined with all the other elements, just the unrelenting energy of it, really does make for quite a compelling listen that's very, very rare to get in this style. It's often one-dimensional, or it's dismissed as one-dimensional, and then people assume that you can be one-dimensional when you play it. But D.R.I really showed how to add layers of complexity and intelligence to what is, stereotypically quite primitive music. And they did it in a very kind of intuitive and sometimes catchy way. So yeah, it's an album that still kind of still has new things to offer and still kind of uncovering things about it to this day. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with an S tier for that. So yeah, Joseph, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is one where we're all very much in agreement. D.R.I. It's funny, actually, when I was first exposed to it was actually a cover that Deceased did of the song Reaganomics on the Behind the Mourner's Veil EP. So that was actually my first exposure, which I feel like a number of bands, like it was some other band covering them first. And then when I got into them, I think either the first or second album that I heard was dealing with it. And it's funny because it is, in a lot of ways, has that, like, proto grind, hardcore punk, like really fast, short songs, sometimes barely a minute long. But then it hits into those like 3-minute ones where it really does get a bit more complex. And knowing myself, I would think, like, I enjoy them up through Thrash Zone, and I would think, I'd enjoy those more because they are a bit more metal. This is the album I always come back to with them. Like, if I had, someone was like, what's D.R.I.'s best album? I would say Dealing With It. Also, it's one of the most memorable things ever in an album is the sample used in Madman of Kurt having an argument with his dad. And I think it's just so perfect for the idea of like some, band in the 80s, like rehearsing in their parents' basement and the parents yelling and screaming, "Turn it down!" It's just the platonic ideal of that scenario that so many kids live through, and it's perfect for that. It really is.
Yeah, that always makes me chuckle to this day. Yeah, just little touches like that kind of give it that sort of like almost homely feel, but they are also dealing with quite quite large themes throughout the album. Like some of the songs are more about personal struggles and stuff, but they also do touch on like why, again, that kind of late Cold War kind of sense of urgency and apocalypticism. It's all here in this album. It just sort of seems to define that era that it came out of in a lot of ways. So yeah, definitely an S tier. So next up we've got Cro-Mags, Age of Quarrel. We're really working through the punk numbers here. So Tyler, what do you make of Cro-Mags? Well, you picked it, so I'm assuming quite highly, but
Yeah, I do think pretty highly of this album. And yeah, as far as the punk numbers go, I definitely went hard in that direction for this episode, and that's just because when it comes to, excuse me, non-extreme metal, a lot of this stuff is some of my favorite stuff. I do like some classic heavy metal and things, and that's going to become apparent on my next pick. But yeah, this is a lot of the stuff that, as far as non-extreme metal goes, I listen to quite frequently. And this album is another one that I listen to quite frequently. This album is interesting because in some ways it is more apparent in its hardcore influences than the three prior albums, but in other ways it's got some more what I would consider clearly thrash metal or perhaps proto-thrash metal riffs going on. Age of Quarrel clearly is considered a classic by many people in both the heavy metal and hardcore punk scenes. It had a massive impact upon both of those genres in many ways. I'm a huge fan of it because of all of the reasons, or many similar reasons to my prior picks, with the kind of stripping down melody to flow and just sculpting that melody on a very raw level. Cro-Mags on this album in particular makes use of a compositional device that I can be a huge fan of when done well, and I feel they do it well on this album, which is a kind of ring composition where they sort of state an initial theme and then provide a contrasting theme and then return to the initial theme, but the return, due to the development of the piece, changes the context of that initial theme in a prismatic way, so to speak. And I think that is really of the bulk of the album is that kind of approach to songwriting, and it really creates this picture, so to speak, of humanity, which clearly in Cro-Mags' world is a very dark picture, a picture where conflict is the driving force, the driving motivational force behind much of the world at the time. And arguably that hasn't changed very much since the time of Age of Quarrel. We could perhaps say that we are still in the Age of Quarrel, if not even more so. But yeah, there's a lot of hard-hitting riffs on this album, a lot of riffs that rhythmically are very pummeling and very catchy in a certain way. You really get this kind of idea that they feel that almost they start to imply that you have to embrace conflict as part of life if you hope to overcome it. You kind of get a sort of summarization of that, like a summation of that idea, even in the kind of one of the most frequently quoted pieces from the song, the World Peace song. World peace can't be done. It's almost as if they're denying the utopian ideal that you can have a world without conflict. So I would probably put this album I don't think I would put it in an S tier because I don't think it's as distinctive as Dealing with It, but I would put it as an A tier. But how do you feel about it, Shelley?
Yeah, I think I'd probably agree with an A. So D.R.I, you kind of Dealing with It, especially, you get this sense of kids basically just looking at the world around them and wondering if they're going insane or the world around them is insane, and just sort of the music that they produced was the only outlet for them to express the madness of it all. Whereas Cro-Mags, you get a bit more of a world weariness to them, because there's a few songs on here sort of referencing the streets and things, and they're much more like out there in the urban environment, and as you mentioned, Tyler, like that nihilism almost of kind of just accepting that conflict is just a fact of life, and the outcome will not be pretty, but you have to find a way to live with that. And it's slightly more thuggish and I don't want to say down to earth, but just a bit more out in the world. What also strikes me about this album is it's relatively slow for a thrash crossover album. Like some of the riffs, the opening riff on the first track, for instance, is very doomy. And you get extended passages like that throughout the album, and even the sort of faster numbers are sort of, mid-paced D beats sometimes. And it kind of, through that, it still carries that sort of malevolence. They managed to kind of encapsulate the heaviness of heavy metal in a lot of ways, through that, but obviously combining it with these energetic moments of, sort of proto thrash, proto, or almost death metal at times as well. They're also, Cro-Mags are a bit of an oddball. Like, they're an interesting group in and of themselves, and this release, it sort of carries those eccentricities as well. Again, as you mentioned, some of the lyrics, there's quite an interesting approach to it. You kind of, because a lot of punk still carries a sense of sort of hope and a sense of, yelling about the world around them, but kind of it contained within that is an implied hope that maybe things will change for the better. Whereas Cro-Mags come at it from a more kind of metal perspective, where they kind of have just accepted that no, there is no hope, and we just have to figure out a way to cope with our environment. And that really comes through on this album, and I think it's one of the reasons why it resonates so much with metalheads as a whole. So yeah, that's my thoughts. I would definitely agree with an A ranking. Joseph, where would you place it?
I think A is very appropriate. B would be too low. I think it's too legendary an album for that. Would it be S tier? You could argue, and certainly I have friends who would argue that, but I think A is a good fit. This Age of Quarrel I think is a fantastic album. I came to it later in life, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, even upon first listen. At times, it's interesting. Like, when I think of like a hardcore, crossover album to pair with something like if I'm listening to like Metallica or Slayer, Cro-Mags easily seems to fit in. Like, I don't know why. Like, maybe you guys can say if this makes sense or not. Like, I feel like it pairs really well with like Ride the Lightning. There's something about it that just sort of seems to fit. It maybe the way they work on the riffing. But yeah, no, I think it's a great album. One thing I'd comment, it's sort of great that this is paired with D.R.I. because just this past fall, I got to see the Cro-Mags live for the first time ever, and they were opening for D.R.I. And they played a small little venue here in Frederick, which I guess got some infamy because Harley got in a fight with some people who were in not the crowd, but like over by the merch area, and he got pepper sprayed, and then like 30 minutes later showed up on stage and ranted a bit about it, but then they win the set. So he was, I don't know, maybe even more energetic than other shows since he'd just been pepper sprayed. That was a very memorable show. And it's funny because I would say I'm a bigger D.R.I. fan, but I think seeing Cro-Mags for the first time, my impression of that show was more as a Cro-Mags show. Like, they really kicked everyone's ass. Not that D.R.I., weren't great, but previously I mentioned with the D.R.I., like, I mean, they've put on some pretty amazing shows. Like, I'll never forget, should have mentioned this before, their more recent bassist, I'll never forget at 2010 Maryland Death Fest, he jumped on stage when Watain was playing and started doing a little jig, and the band wasn't happy with that, so they beat him up and then shoved him to the side of the stage, where I heard apparently security beat him up even further. And then later that night, D.R.I. played, and they definitely let everyone know that happened. Both bands, great. And yeah, Age of Quarrel, easy A.
Awesome. Yeah, I've only ever seen D.R.I. I've never seen Cro-Mags. I saw D.R.I. at Hellfest. I think it was 2010. It would have been around the same time, actually, that of that little anecdote. But yeah, absolutely typical of Cro-Mags just causing problems at shows. But yeah, I think I kind of, with your Ride the Lightning comparison, I can kind of see where you're coming from in that, like, the metal side of this proper was kind of taking the chaos of these albums and sort of putting them in more organized forms. So a track like For Whom the Bell Tolls, like, organizes some of the doomier elements of Cro-Mags, or like some of the thrashier numbers on Ride the Lightning is still very kind of, it has the formal narrative structure of metal, but it takes that energy and that raw kind of urgency of punk and kind of puts it in a more structured way. So yeah, I can kind of see the comparison, but I'd have to listen to both albums back to back to draw that out. But anyway, so that's enough punk for now. So your final pick, Tyler, Killers by Iron Maiden. Bit of an odd one.
Yeah,
In terms of the Iron Maiden discography, anyway.
This is the time for me to irritate perhaps a few people in the audience. I picked Killers by Iron Maiden, an album that I listen to all of the time. I think it's a wonderful album as far as classic heavy metal goes. This is my favorite Iron Maiden album, and you could say in some ways this is the only album by Iron Maiden that I like. Sorry, Iron Maiden fans. I feel that after Bruce Dickinson entered the band, to varying extents depending on the album and even the song in question, Iron Maiden became a lot more vocally focused. And that's understandable in some ways because Bruce Dickinson is a very distinctive vocalist. But the consequence of becoming more vocally focused is that I feel the songs became a bit more poppy. This album, I feel, is very focused on the guitar work, and so you get a much more strong emphasis on a kind of melodically led composition on this album. It sounds almost silly, I suppose, to some hardcore Iron Maiden fans to say that they were more melodically focused on this album than their later albums, and that's not to say that they didn't have, a big emphasis on dual guitar melodies and so on and so forth on most of their discography. But those melodies definitely, I think, became much more hookish and much more emphasizing a sort of like a kind of catchy pop emphasis on short bursts of melody. Whereas on this album, you get this really cool sense of like a flowing guitar melody from the beginning to the end of the piece. It's also a bit more raw and in some ways weird than their later discography, and that kind of rawness and weirdness is something that I really appreciate in albums. I feel that oftentimes it's paired, not always, with a greater sense of creativity. I would also say that when it comes to later metal, that you can hear that kind of emphasis on weird, raw, flowing melody in metal to come. Like, for instance, if you're going to, I think that personally, if you hear any kind of major Iron Maiden influence in some proto-death and black metal like Slayer, especially on Slayer's first album, Show No Mercy, I think there's comparisons to be drawn to this album by Iron Maiden. So I would personally put this album at, I could almost say I would put it at a B, but I'm going to lean towards A. Shelley, how do you feel about Killers by Iron Maiden?
Yeah. No, I think there is a big portion of the fan base that definitely rates the first two Iron Maiden albums more than the Bruce Dickinson era, and I can see why, because that style of, I mean, we haven't discussed this yet, but that style of heavy metal that Iron Maiden are basically the exemplar of, it is an acquired taste despite being hugely popular, and it is a wildly different prospect to the kind of metal that we normally discuss on here, the black and the death metal and the grindcore. It's just, it is sort of tied to like death metal and extreme metal in kind of spirit, and obviously in terms of like the actual culture and the infrastructure of the scene. But it always struck me as kind of odd that once heavy metal split in the 80s, they were still kind of grouped together a lot, because the hallmarks and the things that you listen for are incredibly different. I mean, you've mentioned the vocals is one thing, but also, yeah, the focus on not necessarily hooks, but it does have much more of a melodic focus. It foregrounds the guitar solo a lot more. It can be a lot more linear at times. And yeah, I'm a bit of got a bit of an odd attitude to Iron Maiden. Like, I think the the really classic Dickinson albums, I'm not that keen on. Number of the Beasts, Power Slave, I could take them or leave them. But then when they go a bit more progressive with Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son, I do start liking them again. But then again, it's sort of like the earlier raw stuff, as you mentioned, Tyler. Again, that I like that far more than the Dickinson albums that immediately followed, because again, you kind of get the sense that they're very compact songs, they're very efficient, and they're very focused in a lot of ways. And sometimes they do feel like there's a definite connection between that and the 70s sort of hard rock, proto metal style. But you really see in kind of real time that Iron Maiden are slowly elevating that style to something entirely different through the kind of focus on guitar virtuosity, the raw energy of it, the fact that they pack far more information into each track. They don't just rely on like one sort of signature riff for each track, but there's like a number of riffs that will communicate with each other in a way that is sort of the defining feature of heavy metal. But you kind of see that play out in real time. But this is also Iron Maiden more as like a garage band. You could kind of see them playing in back rooms of pubs and smaller venues and stuff before they blew up, and it is much more like immediate and raw. And although Steve Harrison hates ever being like associated with punk because he detested it at the time, there is that punk energy to it as well, and there's a definite cross appeal there. And this obviously predates sort of the emergence of thrash, but you can kind of easily see that the crossover was already happening before Metallica and Slayer got the ball rolling. There's definitely that undercurrent of like punk energy to this. So yeah, I think I would. I'd want to place it between a A and a B, but I think seeing as you went A, I'll go ahead and agree with that ranking. What are your thoughts, Joseph?
Yeah, I wouldn't give it S, but I think it's a solid A. I mean, the first 7 Maiden albums I think are like pivotal. Like if someone was getting into metal, I would say, everything from the first Maiden album up through Seventh Son is something you should listen to and is a classic. So all of those I would rank somewhere between A and S, although there's another one that comes up later in our list, and that might be my least favorite of the first 7. So I'd at least give this one an A compared to that other album. Tyler, I think is spot on with the connection with Slayer. Like, I think Killers is probably the most important Maiden album for a band like Slayer. Like, I know Kerry King has mentioned in interviews that was his favorite album. I think in particular Purgatory, he said it maybe is his favorite Maiden song ever. So certainly, if one is coming from later music and is sort of like unsure about checking out Maiden, Killers is a fine album, I think, when going from like Death and Black into thrash and then from thrash into earlier. The energy of that time period of the band is something very unique, and it is kind of a shame that a lot of those songs don't get played live as much. I mean, I get it, Dickinson obviously would probably rather perform stuff he's done and recorded. There's some magic about it. It's Maiden with this sort of street punk snot-nosed attitude. And as soon as Dickinson came in, there's some of it still sort of there with Number of the Beast, especially like a song like 22 Acacia Avenue. But certainly after Beast, that attitude kind of disappeared. So it's a real gem in that era. Although for myself, Killers was one of the latter Maiden albums I got into. So my personal preference is for the first self-titled album, especially with songs like Fan of the Opera and Remember Tomorrow. But Killers is solid. And just a shout out to probably my favorite song on that, Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is great. And even in that early element, you still get Maiden referencing literary, important literary works.
Yeah, I think on the Dickinson point, I think he has been explicit about that in interviews where he said, one of the conditions of me joining was that we're going to take it in a much more theatrical kind of epic direction. Because that obviously suits his vocal style, but that's who he is as a person as well. He wants to make it an experience and a performance, and obviously that has great value, and it's obviously done Iron Maiden very well. But it did rob them of those early kind of bit more DIY kind of aesthetic. Anyway, cool. So thank you, Tyler. Some great picks there. So now we're going to move on to my picks. And I will caveat this by saying I don't think all of mine are S, but I think the first pick of mine is definitely an S. Voivod, Dimension Hatross. This is one of my all-time favorite albums of any genre at all. It is the most unique, quote unquote, thrash metal album that has ever been written, and I think the fact that after this, kind of thrash is sort of more remembered for, your big fours or your big threes and stuff, I think is a bit of a tragedy. I think it's great that Voivod have kind of got a second wind in the last few years in terms of putting out new material, but also touring a lot more, and that has led a lot of people to kind of go back and rediscover them. Unfortunately, the rediscovery kind of seems to be seeing them as more of a novelty band of just sort of, sci-fi progressive thrash, which has got really popular in the last few years, but it kind of misses the underlying magic of this album in particular. As in, like, they started out as a very, very sloppy, very, very extreme kind of thrash band that could compete with some of the other albums that we've discussed in terms of just the raw ugliness of it. But they were kind of like a very amateur band held up by an exceptionally gifted guitarist. But by the time this one rolled around, they'd really kind of raised their game, and they were all at the same level. But it's not sort of technically inaccessible. You kind of get this sense of them being still a bit like artisans. They're working musicians. They still have the kind of punk ethos behind them, but they're reaching for a much more ambitious form of songwriting. And it's that kind of swirling dissonance that is really, really striking and has been so influential on a lot of extreme metal that followed. It's very otherworldly and very strange, very kind of abrasive at times, but also oddly hypnotic. It's very, very hard to kind of frame what it is they're doing. Then you get the vocals, which, they move away from the distorted bark of earlier releases, and they go more towards a clean sound, but he makes a point of sounding almost robotic in a lot of ways and synthetic, but not in a sort of novelty way, in a very kind of real and sort of dark way that kind of gives it this very unsettling, uncanny kind of feel to it. And yeah, just very unique approach to drumming as well, very non-linear, very kind of interruptive of the guitars and the way they kind of bounce off each other at times, and just kind of do approaches to stop-start and then builds of momentum, and then and just different sort of tricks that they deploy in each track is just absolutely outstanding. So yeah, I can't really say enough nice things about this album. It's one of these that stuck with me for a very long time, and it's just a complete experience every time I listen to it. And much like the D.R.I, I just get something new out of it every time I approach it. So obviously I'm going to put it in S. I'll hand to Joseph first, and then Tyler.
Yeah, this is Voivod is definitely one of my favorite bands. I fully agree. Putting an S tier, I think this is Dimension Hatross is probably my favorite Voivod album. I don't think it was my first, actually. Like a lot of people getting into bands with sizable legacies, sometimes you get the more contemporary album and then you work your way back. I think my first was it self-titled, the one where Jason Newsted joined with them, the early 2000s, I think.
That's an odd introduction to.
Oh, it is. But that was just the time when I got into them. Because I first got into metal probably around 1999, 2000. So I think, and around that time, Metallica was what I got into, and a lot of things I discovered through Metallica. So I think when it was like, oh, former Metallica bassist Jason Newsted joins Voivod, I was like, oh, I gotta check this out. And that's definitely not my favorite album these days, but but yeah, when I did eventually work my way back, the first album doesn't hit me quite as much, but Roar all the way through to like Angel Rat, I think is just an amazing run. Roar in particular, I think, is rather underrated. Killing Technology is great, but Dimension Hatross is just perfect. I mean, the two sort of singles on it are easily two of my favorite songs, Tribal Convictions and Psychic Vacuum. I remember years ago, I think Voivod put out their first like DVD, and it had all the music videos, and those are easily two of my favorite. I did not see them live until early 2010s. I think they were on tour with Napalm Death, and I finally caught them. I mean, even to this day, they're still amazing live. You know, kind of as you mentioned, that second win they got after Piggy died. But then I forget his name, but the guy from a Canadian death metal scene joined them, and I think he's pretty fucking fantastic. Like, if he had to find a replacement for Piggy, he's done a solid job. But yeah, the energy of that band, and it's interesting because right after Dimension Hatross, you get Nothing Face, which is maybe the most proggy album they ever made, and can be a little difficult, I think, for people to get into. And then you have Angel Rat, which I think is maybe the most underrated because it is a bit more smooth. But in terms of Voivod at the peak of their energy and proggy thrash metalness, I think Dimension Hatross is easily the best entry point into that band. And the only other thing I'll add is probably not the last time I saw them, but I saw them at Decibel Metal and Beer like a year or two ago, and when Tribal Convictions came on, I almost never jump in the mosh pit, but for that one I did, and I made about one ring around the pit till I hit like some spilled beer and totally wiped out and scabbed my knee really badly. But it was all worth it for that band.
Yeah, it's like, Nothing Face is a very odd prospect because in some ways it's not even a metal album. It's more them playing prog rock but being Voivod. It's very strange prospect, and I do absolutely love that album as well. But I think the Dimension Hatross is what I always return to because it still has the vestiges of their roots in sort of very, very primitive thrash. But here they've, as I mentioned earlier, they've sort of organized it into a very formalized and very kind of sophisticated form of metal. So yeah, sorry, Tyler, what are your thoughts?
This is my favorite of the Voivod albums. I don't listen to Voivod that much anymore, but this album in particular, I think, is very interesting in how dense it is. There is a lot of detail packed into each individual piece that is then utilized. It's not just extraneous or ornamentation, but it's actually a mechanism for the development of the song. And in that way, although in a very different style and with a different context, it kind of can at times remind me a bit of some other dense compositions from the extreme metal we usually cover, like Morbid Angel on Blessed Are the Sick, or Burzum perhaps on somewhat on the self-titled and the second album, Det Salmen Gang Var. And some of that similarity comes from the sort of experimentation with harmony and the harmonization, the wash that's created through both dissonance and consonance, and kind of pulling out melodies from that wash of sound and developing them from that point into other themes that are stated throughout the album. I think that really this album, as much as I agree with Shelley, you can hear its roots in more raw hardcore punk or early heavy metal. I think that really this album actually does have, maybe more so than some people will give early Voivod credit for, a lot of its roots in 1970s heavy metal and prog rock, even like groups like King Crimson, and how it approaches a sort of exacting instrumentation to kind of create a weird and quirky sense of composition. So I don't know if I would give this album an S tier, just be on a personal level, because Voivod isn't really something that is part of my regular rotation anymore. But I do certainly think it is the best of their discography. On Voivod in general, I mean, I pretty much stick with Killing Technology, Dimension. I'm never sure how to pronounce it. Hatross.
I think it's
And,
Hatross, but yeah, I don't know.
and even with later Voivod, while some metal purists, pretty much cut it off at Dimension Hatross, like I think that, and this might get some people's feathers a little ruffled, I think that Negatron is a pretty pleasing album to listen to. Is it good in the sense of having a very profound sense of composition and theme? Not really, but it's a well put together album with a good sense of being able to craft a tune. But this album, like I said several times now, best of the Voivod discography, for pretty much all of the reasons that I stated, and perhaps quite a few more. I would probably put it at an A.
Okay.
I would. One thing I remember to add, and I mean, between Shelley, you and me, maybe we, force it into S rather than A. The other thing to consider with Voivod in general, and again, Dimension Hatross is probably the focal point for their classic era. I mean, I don't think you can think of a prog extreme metal band that doesn't cite or look at Voivod as a main influence. All of them. I mean, everything from Gorguts to Enslaved, I think looks at Voivod as a key element to what makes their music. Like, I know Ivar in Enslaved has talked about Voivod being a huge influence in terms of how Piggy, the types of riffs and the types of chord structures he used being a major influence on him. And yeah, I can't think of most proggy death or proggy black metal bands that don't look at Voivod as like part of their lineage.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that comment. As much as I'm not a fan of proggy Enslaved, I think that their influence cannot be understated. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Particularly on like the death metal that followed. Yeah, you could see their fingerprints all over it. Just on your point on Negatron as well, I would say I think of all the 80s bands that a lot of them took very funny turns in the 90s. Voivod did a lot better out of that era than a lot of their contemporaries, shall we say. Yeah, so 2-1 on that, so it's staying in S, much to my pleasure. So the next choice I picked, kind of on a similar kind of line, Dead Brain Cells, first album, self-titled. I'm trying to remember why I picked this one, because I haven't listened to it for a very long time, and I just found myself returning to it quite recently. Dead Brain Cells are perhaps more famous for their follow-up, Universe, which is an incredibly ambitious concept album about nothing short of the history of the universe. And again, similar to Voivod, they attempted to mesh quite spacey, abstract, progressive music with very, very kind of direct thrash, basically. But on this album, they're more just playing very much in their wheelhouse of just straight up thrash metal, basically. And the lyrics are much more grounded. Again, very much in keeping with the kind of thrash metal crossover that we've already been discussing in terms of like that late 80s, late Cold War kind of nihilism that was gripping a lot of people in sort of Western Europe and the US. And on this album, they achieve a similar thing to Voivod, but in a slightly more direct, less roundabout kind of way. The thing that I love about this album is the sort of the paradox of it being very, very simple and compact, but also incredibly complex. Like the way they unravel riffs is very unexpected every time, but also very, very intuitive in a lot of ways. And they'll kind of work through some very sort of meandering, sort of chromatic passages, and then bring it back to something very direct and hard hitting. It's quite light on sort of quote unquote melody proper, but they do kind of sprinkle it throughout the album as well, which really brings in a kind of another dimension to it, an almost like emotive feel. But it's very aggressive and very kind of what's the word? Very sort of muscular as well. So there's a lot to unpack in this album, and I think the reason I picked it is also because Dead Brain Cells are incredibly underrated. I don't think they did much after Universe, so it's probably one of the reasons why they kind of get overlooked in the sort of lexicon of 80s thrash metal. In a lot of ways, they didn't sort of carry on that legacy, and they have kind of, with people sort of re-exploring this era a lot in recent years, they have been uncovered again, and are receiving some attention, but nowhere near to the extent of a Voivod or whatever. So I think I wanted to just flag this album in particular as one where, if you like, for want of a better word, brainy thrash, that really tries to push the boundaries, but also keep things very, very grounded, then this would be the album. And yeah, I was listening to it earlier today, and again, I was just pleasantly surprised by how good it is. It is every bit as good as I remembered it when I first listened to it. So yeah, Joseph, have you listened to Dead Brain Cells before?
So unfortunately, this is the third and last one that I'm not terribly familiar with, and of those three, I think I've listened to this one once, so I really don't have much ground to talk about them. I quickly did a Google. I saw Monstrosity cover them, so there's a connection to the death metal scene. But yeah, no, I'll have to take everyone else's word for this band. Other than just, I guess I wouldn't put it S tier, certainly, because they're not a band that I hear people talk about that much. But when this is done, I'm definitely going to go check them out.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So just before I head to Tyler, I probably wouldn't put it as an S either. I'd probably say it is an A. But yeah, Tyler, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this album, I think that among those who are in the know, might be somewhat overlooked in preference for Universe. But this album is definitely, as Shelley said, underrated in its influence on almost all of metal after it. You hear a really amazing musical tendency in Dead Brain Cells, with sort of riff patterns that pop up in so many bands after their time. Whether those bands were directly influenced by Dead Brain Cells or not, I'm unaware, but they certainly added to the sort of, I don't know how you could put it, gene pool or gestalt of extreme music significantly with their music on this album. And while this is more direct, so to speak, than Universe is, it definitely has less mid-paced territory, and so less contrast in some ways. It is about, in many ways, just equally as Shelley put it, brainy and dense in some ways, although it obviously is very compact in the sense of song length, but dense in the amount of detail and the way that they develop their sort of rhythmic assault throughout the course of this album. I would probably put it as an A, because once again, if I'm like using D.R.I as a point of comparison, I don't know if it's quite as distinctive as D.R.I gets at their best, but I do think that this is a stellar album. And honestly, if anybody wanted to hear sort of the roots of pretty much, like I said, all of the best of heavy metal from this point forward, thrash metal, death metal, and even some black metal alike, I would recommend that you check this out as a sort of undiscovered gem.
Yeah, it's a very interesting period, the late 80s for thrash in general, with like really explicitly proggy bands like Watchtower, and then you've got Voivod and Sadist taking it in a place even more extreme than Slayer, and then bands like, Dead Brain Cells. It's just at the cusp, like obviously death metal was about to take over very shortly, but it's just at the cusp of like this, just lots and lots of activity, lots of creativity going on. So to take it a little bit earlier now, back to 1980, I believe. My next pick is Angel Witch, their debut, self-titled. This is an album that I appreciate more in spirit and concept than actually enjoying listening to it. As a sort of new wave of British heavy metal album, it's very rough and ready, and I think that's one of the reasons why it stuck with me, because it sort of reminds us that although that scene and that style became very, as we discussed with Iron Maiden, it became very kind of grandiose and ambitious and sometimes a bit too theatrical for its own good, it kind of reminds us that it was basically a working class urban sort of form of music that came out of the urban sprawls of Birmingham and London and Yorkshire, and it wasn't as always as quite as silly as it came to be. And on Angel Witch you do get that sense of just a band thrashing it out in their garage, with what equipment they can afford, sort of reaching for something more than their means. They're not the most technical band, although the musicianship on this album is solid, but it is very kind of accessible in a sort of artisanal way, in a way not sort of poppy, but in a there's not any kind of flourishes, there's no flashes on the production. It's very kind of basic, just guitar, bass, drums, go. And some of the themes on here, they do dabble in more fantastical themes, occultist themes and stuff, but there's also, again, there's vestiges of realism there, like a song about sort of being released from prison and coping with the kind of mental turmoil of that and things like that. I just it is just one of these oddball albums, but it has been incredibly influential over like most of the metal that followed. I think because there's a darkness to it as well, there's an underlying kind of misery to it that you don't really get from Iron Maiden, who were much brighter and more energetic, whereas Angel Witch are far sort of more drab and sort of downtrodden. You get this real sense of kind of what's the word? Not sort of misery, but yeah, a slightly kind of downtrodden feel to it that I find really compelling. And then songwriting wise, it is very basic, but very intuitive and very kind of creative in a lot of ways. But yeah, I know I submitted it, but because I don't enjoy it as much as some of the other albums, I'm probably going to rank it as a B. But yeah, so Joseph, what are your thoughts on Angel Witch?
I mean, it's funny because when we put these lists together, I was sort of the last one to come to it, so obviously I wasn't going to pick something someone else had already picked. But this was one I very likely would have picked on my own. Angel Witch is one of my favorite, classic or traditional heavy metal albums. I think it's amazing. I would definitely put it higher than B. I mean, in personal rankings, I would probably consider an S, but A, I think I'd be very satisfied with. It's funny because for you, it seems like it's sort of an academic almost enjoyment of the album. For me, it's an album I put on and very viscerally enjoy. Just the riff craft, I think, is amazing. I don't know what it is. It's just an album that consistently I find enjoyment in. It's funny because it's probably the second most famous song with the title Angel of Death. And I have to, at times, almost blasphemy, but I think I might like their Angel of Death more than Slayer's, which, that's almost heretical. It's such an interesting one, too, because it's one of those sort of lost gem type of new wave of British heavy metal albums, because after this, they just really kind of fell apart. And they have gotten back together and done some recent albums, which I enjoy those quite a bit. But yeah, sort of in the realm of like Diamond Head and Witchfinder General, like an album or two, and then Satan certainly is another one. An album too, and then things just kind of fell off until, decades later, reunions occurred. And there's something about that, I think, that adds to the mystique of it, that like there was this magical moment for this band and then it just kind of vanished. Like they made a deal with the devil and, they got an album or two out of it and then, dragged down into hell as a consequence of, going for such glory. And yeah, I also know this album gets mentioned a lot by Tom G. Warrior as like one of the two albums that inspired him to start Hellhammer. So certainly with that extreme metal connection, it's very clearly in that. I think the first Venom album in this he always cites as the reason he started doing music. And And certainly with the occult themes that are in this album, I think it's sort of a nice bridge between, say, like early Maiden and Venom. Like Angel Witch kind of gives you this, like it's a bit of a tendon between those two bands in the eras for those bands.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it, actually. And yeah, like you mentioned, yeah, a lot of these bands didn't make it because they kind of, yeah, they fell apart. They only managed a couple of albums. But yeah, if they'd kept going, like, it was only like the Iron Maidens that kind of got massive and took over the world. But, Angel Witch could have been there if they'd carried on, maybe with a new lineup or whatever. But yeah, they kind of became, as you mentioned, retrospectively discovered and, yeah, as a result, kind of reformed. So yeah, Tyler, what are your thoughts?
I'm somewhat more along your thought process on this album, Shelley. I enjoy the spirit and the concept of it a little more than listening to the album itself. In many ways, you get vestiges of sort of the late 1970s kind of, I don't necessarily want to say stadium heavy metal that you hear in some of the kind of growing new wave of British heavy metal scene at the time, still found on this album. But its influence, I think, is unquestionable. And there are motifs on this album, like in the song Angel of Death, as Joseph mentioned, that were of huge influence to how later heavy metal would approach melody and song development. Joseph mentioned their impact directly on Hellhammer, for instance. And I think that as a sort of example of cult early heavy metal that was part of the kind of ethos of really all underground metal from that point forward, the kind of DIY, true to the scene, like a community for people who were willing to do the footwork to look for the actually good bands. That Angel Witch was like a cultural example of what that was during this time period. And of course, that carried forth into almost all of metal from this point forward, as far as the people in the heavy metal genre who were actually engaging in the creative work rather than kind of drifting heavy metal more towards mainstream sounds. So in that regard, I would probably put this album as a B, because actually listening to it, there is, on a kind of personal enjoyment level, not quite enough there for me to want to listen to it on a very regular basis, other than on occasion, just out of sort of appreciation for its place in the pantheon of heavy metal, and because there's plenty of enjoyable moments on the album. It definitely has a good approach to songwriting. Out of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, they're one of the ones that has the most underground approach to melody and to presentation. But it just doesn't quite have as much personal appeal to me as other music from even around or in relatively close proximity to this same era, like Killers by Iron Maiden, for instance. So I would rank it as a B.
Well, yeah, can't argue with the numbers there.
One thing I would add, and I'm fine. I think 2-1. If you want to say B, sure. I think it's only fair in that way. But the one thing I would say for anyone who isn't familiar with Angel Witch, I think, when you look at the new wave of British heavy metal and which of those bands influenced certain bands that came later, especially in the thrash metal scene, I think Angel Witch probably had the biggest influence on Megadeth of like the big four. And I think you can really tell in especially the first two Megadeth albums. Like, you listen to those and you listen to Angel Witch and you'll see the connections.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to do that because I'm less familiar with Megadeth. I do listen to them now and then, but yeah, I'd have to go back to that. So yeah, next up, I'm just gonna shove this up here. Discharge. Hear nothing, see nothing, say nothing.
Wholeheartedly agree. This album is a bombshell. Let's get into it.
I agree, but also as revenge for Angel Witch, I kind of want to track it down. But
Don't take out on Discharge.
but Tyler, go.
This is Shelley's album.
Yeah,
Shelley's going to introduce it.
Yeah.
Okay. How do I introduce this one? It's basically the mother of all punk albums as far as like the things we've discussed go. The guitars sound like an air raid siren. Obviously, we all know that this was the foundation of D-Beat. The drum beat style on here, you basically wouldn't have had the style that Slayer went for without this album, and by extension, obviously, a lot of extreme metal. It is one of the most overwhelming cacophonies of noise. Like each song is barely two riffs, very, very basic, very simple, and just this kind of sloganeering in the vocals where it's just a few lines just bellowed at the listener. Again, just with some sense of urgency that just the world around you is going completely insane, or either you yourself are insane, and just needing some kind of way to express that. And I think more than any of the other albums here, this one just has that laser-like focus on expressing that, because it is in reality, it is incredibly simple, the way they do it. But just through that conviction and through that just intensity, the raw energy of it, they kind of get at something about the human condition, especially in modern times, that really just sticks with you. And I remember just being recommended this album as like, well, it's very pivotal to early extreme metal, and I was not prepared for just how extreme it sounds to this day. It still kind of blows a lot of subsequent albums out of the water in terms of its just raw intensity. Whenever we tend to get an S-tier album that has been with me for many, many years, I'm very passionate about, I do struggle to kind of frame it properly, probably why I tend to write opinions on music more than speak them. So I will hand over to Joseph now before I just start rambling on.
Despite what I said earlier, I mean, this is a legendary album. Certainly, whatever people could say about its musicality is so overwhelmed by its influence on just about everything. Thrash metal, death metal, and even to a certain extent black metal, and certainly grindcore. Like, it's just such a figment. And like you said, D-Beat, like the Swedish, the Swedish death metal scene wouldn't be what it is without this album. The funny thing for me is this was one of the earlier exposures I had getting into music, because Metallica was my first entryway. In the Garage Inc. album, they covered 2 tracks from Discharge, so I actually heard those pretty early on in my journey into music, and those stuck with me. And eventually I did grab Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing. It's great, it's punchy, it has this weight that so much other punk sometimes can feel a little thin, but this just feels like a goddamn Panzer tank. And it's funny enough, like in relation to that, like I don't think you get an album like Marduk's Panzer Division without something like this. It's tied in with the crust punk beginnings of that, the D beats, the what was it, the UK 82 scene, so very much companion to stuff like GBH, but this is very much, it's a unique album. There really isn't a lot of stuff from that time period that sounds exactly like this. There's also, it has probably one of the most harrowing uses of a sample tied to a song, when it's got the newsreel report about children burned from a nuclear weapon, and then goes into either, what was it, Hell on Earth, and it's just visceral in that sense.
Awesome. Completely agree. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
All right, so this album is really absolutely indispensable with its influence on pretty much everything as far as extreme music after it. Interestingly enough, as Shelley covered, it's a very simple album song construction wise. You largely get a verse chorus format, 2 riffs per song, but its innovation that I consider monumental is the sort of ambient drone riffing that it creates. It almost divorces the rhythm guitar from following the rhythmic pattern of the drums, which was largely the approach of most rock music, as you could put it, prior to this album. And there were bands that were moving in this direction or experimenting with a similar approach, but Discharge really explicitly created this sense of the rhythm guitars leading the composition by having a sort of droning stream of melody that was then taken up by later artists in extreme music and advanced upon to create some of the most compelling music in the modern era. And because of that, I don't think that Discharge can be thanked enough. That also, to their credit, that approach to riffing was really tied into the theme of the album, because that droning sense of melody that they create, the fact that it's so disaffected from rhythm, and the fact that the vocals are almost a sort of madman afterthought, almost just like somebody shouting randomly in the midst of a chaotic night. It really emphasizes the theme of despair, and a sort of dark nihilistic despair, really, not so much of a sort of personal emotional one. The kind of D-beat drum pattern that has been talked about really serves this album well in kind of placing the rhythm section of the music into an almost just purely timekeeper role, so that the droning melody can almost in an ambient way float over the rhythm and lead the changes in the song. And I think that's exceptional. I think that Discharge really should be credited with creating one of the most foundational aspects of extreme music after it, is that ambient flowing sense of melodicism that I think that most death metal and even black metal after it kind of took up and developed further. So I would put this in an S tier just for its influence in that regard.
I mean, yeah, you've both been quite hesitant about sort of the references to black metal, but I think that's undeniable in some of the rawer aspects of black metal, like especially someone like Iljan, where I see Iljan as like a direct descendant of albums like this in terms of their attitude and approach and outcome, in terms of just stripping everything back to its most basic components and then sort of rebuilding on that. So yeah, no, glad we are all in agreement on that. So Undisputed S.
I would also add that if you want to think of both their influence into death metal, I already said it. Their influence on a band like Bolthrower, I think, is undeniable. Like, you can clearly see that connection.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And yeah, again, sort of, well, Bolthrower kind of, they did start out from quite a punky place as well, and kind of translated that language into the more sort of ambitious kind of death metal kind of direction that they took. So the next album, I was just Googling how to pronounce it because I've never actually said it out loud. I think Tolkien pronounced it Cirith Ungol, but the band pronounced it Cirith Ungol.
Correct.
Yeah, it's Cirith Ungol. I am a huge Tolkien nerd, and that is how it's properly pronounced, but yeah.
So we will go with Cirith Ungol. So this is my kind of heavy metal. It is abrasive as fuck. It is much like the Angel Witch. It's very raw, very DIY. There's no flashes of theatricality. It's very sort of blue collar in a lot of ways. But the musicianship is just endlessly creative. It indulges in guitar solos to the point of absurdity, but they're not just kind of fluff or filler. They're very sort of directional guitar solos. They're very focused on where they need to be and where they need to go, and sort of taking the song from one place to another. And not just that, but also sort of a lot of the riffing is just almost like so simple that it's odd that you kind of think, how did no one think of that before? But it's very, very intuitive, and very kind of conscious of where each riff needs to be within the flow of a song. And you do still get like the classic 70s metal DNA within this, particularly in sort of the interaction of the drums. There's a lot of kind of references to Sabbath, and indeed this album and this band are sort of very influential on sort of later doom metal. We're about to discuss a sort of pillar of doom metal in a moment, but this album is quite a big influence on that, particularly the epic sort of strand of doom metal. And then obviously we can't really talk about this album without mentioning the vocals, which is what's going to put most people off, because he just sings in this high-pitched screech, and there is no attempt to ingratiate the vocals to the listener in any way, or kind of vary them, or maybe offer some softer passages here and there. It is just a cacophony of screeches, which I kind of think is really fitting, because the album is very rough around the edges anyway, and I quite like just this very, very intense, energetic kind of narrator that you get through these quite epic kind of almost fantastical pieces, and you do get this guy just screeching in your ear, and it kind of really does wake you up. It's almost like a shot of adrenaline in a lot of ways. So yeah, a very, very special, very unique album, but I understand that it might be very much an acquired taste, but I definitely prefer this approach to sort of straight edge heavy metal to sort of other kind of things that were going on in this era when metal was getting a little bit more grandiose and ambitious, and sort of lots and lots of furniture and additional flourishes and stuff. This kind of brings it back to basics and says, no, we need to just creative riffing, creative songwriting, creative soloing. That's where it needs to be, and let's just focus on that. And you know, the fact that it's very rough around the edges is almost like a bit of a gatekeeping act in a way, because if you need all of the cinematic production, like big budget kind of escapades to sort of enjoy it, then you're not sort of really enjoying the music itself. You're enjoying something else that's kind of sugar coated. I don't think I put it as an S, because I don't like it as much as the albums that are in the S tier, but I definitely say it's an A. Joseph, what are your thoughts?
It's hard for me to be objective when it comes to Cirith Ungol, because a few years ago, after they reunited and they started releasing new music, I had the opportunity to interview them, and that to this day might be one of my favorite moments in my life, because I the only time I've ever been able to interview an entire band in the same room in one go, and then at the end of it, you know, we talked and everything, and I'm hearing crazy stories about, you know, bands and gigs and things they did back in the 70s and even before the band even formed, really. And then they're like, hey, do you want to just hang around and watch us rehearse for a festival we're going to play? And I got to basically have a private concert. Wow. yeah, it was insane. And then even more so because that was February of 2020. So that festival never happened. So I potentially could have been the last. I potentially could have been the last person to have ever seen Cirith Ungol play. So I have a very hard time to be objective, and I feel very protective of this band because I've gotten to know some of the guys in the band, and I think they're just great people. But to someone, you know, unknowledgeable, they're part of. It's funny because I don't think back in the day it was ever really referred to this, but like these days it's called like the U.S. power metal scene, or which is tied into one of my choices that we'll talk about later. But yeah, the vocals are definitely kind of in the same way of King Diamond. They're something you kind of have to get used to at first. Tim Baker, his vocals are very, very distinct. But it's very rewarding, especially if you enjoy stuff like, in terms of those 70 roots that they have, like if you enjoy Rush and we're like, man, I would love to have like a more metal Rush with maybe a little less proggy, like songs don't have to be 9 or 10 minutes. Cirith Ungol very much fits that. I often talk about this, and the other band we'll be talking about later, sort of like if you go visit your grandparents and you go up in the attic and you find some dust-covered pulp novels, that's what Cirith Ungol feels like. It feels like this little treasure trove you found that's been covered in dust, or, very much fitting with the themes they do, which is a lot of this pulp sort of sci-fi and fantasy and horror, and certainly in the lyrics it shows up. And, it just has that allure of something old and forgotten that's been discovered, which very much is the case because they were a band that had a lot of difficulty, tried to make it, and just time and time again got kicked in the balls and and tried to get back up. I know with this album, I think it was pretty DIY, like self-financed, which is why it took 4 years after the debut. And this still had like half the songs I think they actually composed in the late 70s. And it was only 2 albums after this one that they broke up and stayed broken up for, like 20 years or so. And I was fortunate enough to go to the very first reunion show they had at the Frost and Fire Festival, and I forget what year it was, like 2017 or something like that. And I remember with bated breath, everyone wondering, would Tim's vocals still be up to match? Would the band be up to match? And when they hit that stage, I mean, it was just amazing. Everyone's jaw was on the floor, because now I think it's funny because I would actually recommend some of the newer stuff they've done post-reunion as a gateway, because Tim's vocals have aged a lot better, I think, and are a little more gravelly now with his age, and that's maybe a little easier to get into compared to back in the day, where it's very high-pitched and can be, a very much required taste. But at the same time, King of the Dead is probably the most de facto Cirith Ungol album. Like, it's, if you're going to think of the classic era of them album, this is the one to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would definitely agree about the newer albums in terms of being a gateway, because they are really solid as far as like the recent like spate of comebacks that we've had. But they're really kind of a good summation of what they sound like, but yes, slightly less on the abrasive side. But once you've got into that, then definitely King of the Dead would be the next one I'd recommend. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
Cirith Ungol is a really interesting band of this time period. They have elements that are very doom-like. They have, I guess, what you could call a sort of proto-power metal aspect to them, and then they also have some aspects of the NWOBHM scene at the time. While they are very different from Sabbath in some ways, they have a similarity in the sense that the music, especially on this album, kind of somewhat relies on low, dark, rumbly, plodding riffs at times. That being said, I have a strange relationship with this band because I feel that it is a band that I should like a lot more than I do. All aspects of this band make me feel that I should be really into them, and I've tried to get into them on many occasions, and I always don't really feel like listening to them. It's not that I think that it's bad. It's not bad at all, and I can definitely recognize its quality and its influence, but it just doesn't grab me in the way that some other albums from this period do. That being said, there's nothing wrong with this album at all, and there's nothing wrong with this band and most of its discography at all, and I would consider it a very legitimate early heavy metal album for any self-respecting metalhead who likes authentic heavy metal to listen to. But if I were going to rate it based on my personal feelings about the band, I would probably put it at a B. I am the outlier on this, however, so I submit to the will of the majority on this one.
Well, I don't think, Joseph, you gave it one, but could you live with A?
Given the acquired taste nature of it, I think an A is perfectly fine. Like, if someone wanted to put, I mean, I would put it alongside Angel Witch, but I thought that deserved an A. So A I think is fine. The only other thing I'd mention to our listeners is Cirith Ungol has announced that this is going to be the last year of them doing anything remotely like touring or playing live. I imagine they may do still some one-offs, probably still in the Southern California area in years to come, but it sounds like due to a number of factors, this is the last big hurrah. So if you see they're playing a festival or show near you, know that this may well be the last chance you get to see. And if you haven't bought a ticket yet, going to Hell's Heroes in Houston in March is a fine opportunity to go see them.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think I did hear that, but yeah, I've been kind of out of the loop lately.
Well, and I know for you, and I might try to make it. I know they're going to play Limerick in Ireland. I don't know if they're playing. I think they're playing London as well, though.
Well, yeah, London would be easier for me, obviously, but cool. Okay, yeah, I'll have to keep an eye out. So yeah, that concludes my picks. So Joseph, we're now on to you. So do you want to introduce this band, Candlemass? I think I've heard.
Yes.
Candlemass. Quit joking around, Shelley.
I chose their debut album, Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus, which is maybe interesting to some people because I think of their albums, the most famous or well-known is probably Nightfall, which had a different vocalist. But for whatever reason, Epicus has always been my favorite. Something about it that just, I don't know, hits a little harder for me. It's really hard to explain. There's just something a little more dark about it. This is the album. I mean, it's funny, because the fake Latin title, epic doom metal, and essentially this album did create that as a genre. Candlemass pretty much are cited as the first epic doom metal band, which, for those kind of unaware of it, it's sort of taking the doom metal of the more Sabbathy era and then adding in sort of the epicness of some of the new wave of British heavy metal, and especially I would say like something like Rainbow, especially during Dio's tenure. So sort of that, and we'll mention another album actually right after this one that probably played a big influence on them. This was also kind of the first big metal band other than Bathory to kind of break out in Sweden. I mean, you have bands like Heavy Load and some others as well. And the one thing with Bathory is Bathory, other than those handful of shows that supposedly people saw, Candlemass were the first big one to actually play live and tour. And I know you talk to a lot of guys in the extreme Swedish scene, and they'll talk about Candlemass being sort of those godfather-like figures to the entire scene. A lot of the lyrics kind of similar to Angel Witch and some of the other bands and albums we talked about are very kind of mystical and occult-based. Solitude, the opening track, has this... It's interesting because it definitely hits on the depressive nature that doom metal sometimes has, but then singing along with the chorus of this earth to earth, ashes to ashes builds this epic tension in it. And I could go on and on with each song, but I also would want to mention like Sorcerer's Pledge. Often at times feels like the most epic of what Rainbow was doing, especially on something like Rising, turned into this darker iteration. And that's always been one that I love, this idea of this sorcerer who's been sleeping, waiting for his time to come and rule the world as the evil warlord. And yeah, it really hits, especially as a teenager, like discovering this when I was like 15 or 16, it really hits your imagination in the best of ways. And for now, I'll leave it at that, but I'll probably add a few more things when Shelley and Tyler talk about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I'm more familiar with Nightfall, but I do kind of agree there is a darker edge to this album. And so, like, people try to sort of contrive sort of groups of bands sort of after the fact, but they're sort of lumped in with along with St. Vitus and Pentagram as like the big three of early doom metal. But I always resonated more with Candlemass because they've sort of stripped out the blues sort of vestiges from their sound, and as you mentioned, they are very much a post new wave of British heavy metal band, in that they are borrowing heavily from the melodic content and the thematic ideas of that movement, and then bringing it back to the doomier elements of Black Sabbath. And there's also, it's very funereal and dark and almost like tragedian in a way, and you can see its influence not just on the doom metal that followed, but also like the goth element to it as well. But the peaceful free, like My Dying Bride, things like that, and probably also death metal bands that went in a slightly more gothic tinged direction lean heavily on this album and subsequent albums. So yeah, it's very. I understand what you mean, though. It's quite hard to encapsulate where how this album kind of meets the lister, but it is very kind of earthy. It sort of hits on a sort of deeper level than a lot of doom metal manages to do, and to some extent Candlemass after this album as well. So yeah, it's not a style that I reach for very often, but when I do, I'm always glad that I've put this album on, because it is always a pleasant surprise how good it is and how foundational it is. It's almost a cliche that they've called their album that, but it is sort of warranted in a lot of ways, far more than Venom's black metal anyway. But yeah, Tyler, I'll hand to you now.
Yeah, when we're talking about Nightfall being the most widely appraised Candlemass album, I personally prefer this album and Ancient Dreams more than Nightfall. Nightfall isn't a bad album, but the debut and Ancient Dreams are my favorites by that band. This album is really interesting in what's already been said about it, about having a darker edge to some extent than the albums after this. It's also, even for a doom metal album, unusually, not in a bad way, slow and kind of simplistic, at times anyhow. But where this album really shines through, and I think maybe even in some ways more so than their later material, is that kind of heavy metal, powerful, gothic sense of finding beauty in darkness, in like the weight, which is where I think the term heavy and heavy metal comes from, more so than just the sonic qualities of it. The weight of the darker aspects of life, like death. And in that regard, I think this album is an exceptional entry into exploring darker aspects of music of this time. And as Shelley said, I think that it was kind of a huge influence on later bands with exploring similar topics. I mean, even when you're talking about things as seemingly removed as the most black and dark of extreme metal, you had interesting kind of social aspects like Dead from Mayhem appearing in a Candlemass music video. So I think that they were really well loved by a lot of those musicians from those scenes. And then, of course, there's the fact that Bolt Thrower, once they developed in their more epic direction, I think has outright said that the biggest influence in them developing that sound and moving out of the more extreme grindcore sound was Candlemass. So I would probably rank this album, well, not probably, I would definitely rank this album as I think I would put it as an A.
Okay. Joseph, can you live with that?
I can. My vote would be for S, since it's probably one of my all-time favorite albums ever. But and if both of you feel more A, I'm fine with putting it.
I do feel more A, I'm afraid, but it's
perfectly
the
fine.
numbers, I'm afraid, but it is a very respectable A.
Yeah. No, I would be protesting hard if it were B, but A's perfectly satisfactory.
If there was between rankings, I would probably put it between an A and an S, if that makes you feel better.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, and also it's interesting to know with that album that Candlemass has sort of had a weird membership trajectory. Obviously, like I mentioned, Nightfall and then onward with Ancient Dreams and such, they had Messiah, who much more operatic sort of style of vocals, kind of taking sort of a King Diamond thing just without the focus on falsetto. Because I know he's definitely cited King Diamond as one of his biggest influences. But this one, I think, and it's kind of why I love. It was an album I thought about putting in here, but I didn't because I didn't want to do something where it was an extreme metal that turned into less extreme. But like Bathory during the Viking era, like Hammerheart and Twilight of the Gods. One thing I love about those albums is I feel like Horthrone trying to clean sing and pushing himself perhaps beyond his actual talents, and that pushing yourself beyond your means creates this kind of emotional tension that I really feel in the album, where Messiah, I don't think, ever felt like he was pushing beyond what he knew he could do. And the interesting thing with that, the vocalist on this album, Johan Lindqvist, after this album just basically disappeared, and I think he was working with some rock and roll bands or stuff like that, but only not that many years ago rejoined Candlemass, has done an album or two now with them, and hearing these songs live with him back in the band is such a treat, and I'm looking forward to seeing that again at Hell's Heroes.
Really plugging that festival.
And there's probably another band or two where I could probably do that. So,
so your next choice, Black Sabbath, Mob Rules. This was an odd one for me. So, do you want to just talk around why you picked it?
Yeah, I can already predict this might get thrown into B. Which, if so, okay. It's interesting because. It's funny. I've been thinking about this lately that I seem to pull up the Dio era Sabbath albums more than the Ozzy ones of the last, 5 years or so. I'm not quite sure what that is, but I mean, I think that run of the Rainbow albums into Sabbath is some of just the most amazing heavy metal and very early heavy metal that was ever written. And certainly, I think the roots of epicness in heavy metal. Like, you go from Rainbow Rising, through Long Live Rock and Roll, into Heaven and Hell, into Mob Rules. I think that forms sort of the epic metal nature that then stuff like Candlemass pulls and some of the US power metal pulls. Certainly stuff like Manowar, I mean, especially considering one of the guys I think was a techie for Sabbath for a while when Dio was in the band, I think. So I think just the impact of that, and certainly a lot of the power metal bands look to the Dio era. And it's weird, and this isn't going to be the only example of this. It's sort of a sister album because when you think of the Dio era, most people do think of Heaven and Hell first. And both albums have a very similar tracking, like the way the songs are placed in the album. Very similar, sort of in the same way, like if you compare Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, where you have like a fast track, then you have something a little more groovy, then you have a big epic, and so on and so forth. I think, I don't know why Mob Rules. Personally, I think because I remember getting this album first, so it had that impact. But also just because of the Dio era, the song on this album, The Sign of the Southern Cross, is just maybe one of my favorite songs of all time. Like, I will put this on in the car. I mean, it's a good long track, almost 8 minutes, but if I have the time, I will just belt out the lyrics to this song while I'm driving down, and it's one of my favorite feelings I ever get, just singing it. If to those listening, if you've never done it before, check out Henry Rollins talking about Ronnie James Dio, and there's just something about Dio when he's really hitting these epic moments that just makes you feel like a kid again, and you want to grab like a towel and a paper clip or something and turn it into a cape, and you just imagine you're like this warrior or sorcerer on top of a mountain singing or cursing the gods. Like, it's just this emotional pull with what he's doing on these albums. And that song is probably what pushes it above Heaven and Hell for me.
Yeah, so I listened to the first 6 Sabbath albums religiously, and for a long time I never bothered with anything afterwards. And then I thought, well, I should like check out, especially the Dio era. And it's kind of like, as Tyler was mentioning with Iron Maiden to some extent, the magic of the first 6 Sabbath albums comes from the interaction of Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne. Basically, Ozzy Osbourne was like the vocalist for that band. He's not as talented as Dio by any stretch, but he has an unmistakable voice, and he brings that unmistakable, glum, drab, miserable kind of thing that they became, was so influential and was sort of, but part of the darker aspects of what they were doing compared to a band like Led Zeppelin or whatever. With Dio, that's when, as you kind of mentioned there, the thread of making heavy metal epic, but you also get this brightness to it as well, and this virtuosity and theatricality. And I think Dio is, obviously, he's one of the finest vocalists in metal, and he's deeply respected for that reason. But Tony Iommi's riffing suffers as a result, I think. There's fewer interesting riffs across these albums. Some of them feel a bit like he's on autopilot a bit, and he is just kind of leaning on Dio's talents to sort of carry the song through, which is fine. Like, Dio can, he was easily sort of capable of sort of compensating for a band like maybe, only working at half their kind of abilities. Not to say that there's not any distinctive riffs on this album, but it does feel like Sabbath are going in a much more stripped down, direct sort of direction, very kind of energetic but simple riffing that's used to sort of...
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I know, and I forget the exact details, but I know that Dio talked about when working on these albums with Tony, like, Tony changed his guitar playing. Like, I think he adapted certain styles or certain methods of crafting riffs that he had never done before in Black Sabbath. And I think maybe that had been Ronnie bringing in some of the stuff he'd picked up from Winning Rainbow being with Ritchie Blackmore. So I think some of that, definitely influenced those albums.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You could definitely hear that, and also, like, credit to them, there was like a second wind at this point, and they did kind of manage to keep up with the times. But yeah, for me, it's not for me. It's a little bit too clean and a little bit too sanitized, I think. Like, I could fully respect Dio's vocals, but I think I do prefer his work with Rainbow. And yeah, the Sabbath, it's kind of, it just doesn't feel like quite the same band. I know literally it's not, but the same members are kind of, they're just not bringing their A game. And it's partly because the first 6 albums are so important to me, I think. But so Tyler, what are your thoughts?
I've always said that I prefer Ozzy era Sabbath, but not for Ozzy. That instrumentally, Ozzy era Sabbath is more compelling to me. It's more dark and nihilistic in a way, but that vocally, Dio era Sabbath is far superior. I think that's already been thoroughly covered here, but obviously Dio is a much more accomplished vocalist than Ozzy is, in my opinion. Not just with his range, but also with even his sense of melody. And in some ways, that's both a good and a bad thing, in my opinion. A good thing in that, obviously, he has more skill in that area, but also a bad thing in that it opened up the avenue for Sabbath to let the guitars take a back seat and allow Dio to lead the melody. And my problem with that, and this could just be a personal foible of mine, is that when vocals lead the melody, usually the melody is more curtailed because the human voice, unaided, by any kind of technology, is usually less capable. Not only less capable, of crafting longer melodies, but also in order to be able to make sense of lyricism without just fully engaging in non-verbal vocal noises, you have to kind of shorten the melody. And you definitely get a sense of that on Dio era Sabbath, in that it sounds more like the traditional idea of heavy metal than Ozzy era Black Sabbath does. It loses some of the progginess, in my opinion. Not all of it, but some of it. And it also loses some of that sense of it almost developing into a strange creature throughout the course of a song. But that being said, out of the Dio era albums, this is my favorite of them. I think it's an excellent album. It definitely has a really powerful and enjoyable sense of melody, in the sense of just a good heavy metal album that I think stands above many other similar examples of just solid traditional heavy metal albums. I'm a really big fan of the theme of the title track. You know, if you listen to Fools, the Mob Rules, I think that's a pretty common sentiment throughout heavy metal. Dio is just one of those, Dio era Sabbath and Dio in general, I think is just one of those heavy metal artists that, however you feel about heavy metal as an entire genre, you can have a lot of respect for the man, and you can have a lot of respect for the material that he's done, both as a solo artist and with Black Sabbath and Rainbow. So I think this is a solid choice for anybody to enjoy. I would probably, on a personal level, as far as how much I enjoy it, rank it at about a B. But once again, that's just my personal opinion.
I was going to rank it as a B as well. Sorry, Joseph.
It's fine. We can put it there. I would put it between A and S, but B is perfectly fine. I'm well aware, compared to Ozzy, Sabbath, it just does not have the cachet.
Yeah.
One thing I would mention, sort of an interesting comparison between Ozzy and Dio. I really recommend the Dio documentary that came out a few years ago. It's a really great look across all the bands he was in and the material, and gives some interesting insight, like behind the scenes stuff. But one thing that's interesting to note is, I know Ozzy, and if you hear the first Sabbath album, you know he's playing the harmonica on The Wizard, and you can kind of think of that, you know, vocalists in terms of if they have any background in a vocal-based or any kind of air-based instrument, what kind of vocals do they have? And you can compare that Ozzy as a harmonica player to Dio, who was, by trade, a trumpet player. And I think that kind of shows in terms of like how, by playing the trumpet growing up, that really had an impact on his vocals and the kind of range and way he projected his vocals.
That Dio documentary is phenomenal, by the way. So yeah, I highly recommend it as well. It's a good watch.
And Shelley, I would recommend that one song that I mentioned. Like, just go back and give that a hear and see.
All right, okay. So, Manilla Road, Crystal Logic.
Yes. And again, like I said, with the Dio Sabbath, I feel like kind of really bringing in, along with Rainbow, bringing in the epic nature. Certainly, I mean, it's interesting. I thought about including something like Rainbow's Rising, because I really do think that's where it all begins. It's Richie, and, you know, as Tyler will remember from that documentary, Dio and Richie's interest in classical music and wanting to bring that into, at that time, you know, heavy metal was barely talked about, but bring that into hard rock. And I think that's really where you do get a lot of the roots, especially classical into heavy metal. Like Rainbow Rising is probably one of the earliest examples of it. But Manilla Road is probably most closely related to Cirith Ungol, in that they're one of these bands of the quote-unquote US power metal scene who never got a lot of attention back in the day, and it really, I feel like, wasn't until later bands started exposing their fans to bands like Manilla Road. And again, another band, especially because of the vocals, very distinct and for some people very hard to get into. But part of the appeal is sort of this lost gem. I mean, you look at that album cover right there, and it is definitely a bit amateurish. But that's kind of part of the charm. Like when you get like an old pulp novel and you look at the cover and it looks like some weird, crazy fantasy thing. But then, you open it up and you really enjoy it. The only downside on that album is the one song Feeling Free Again, which is sort of a love song, which almost feels like it's tacked onto the album. That one feels a little odd, but otherwise, just start to end, it's really great. They really do a good job of including certain choruses in the song that just makes you want to sing at the top of your lungs. There's a heaviness and a darkness to it too. It's not light and airy. I mean, it is mostly fantasy based, but there is sort of this dark fantasy sort of feel to it. And the pinnacle of the album for me is the most epic track, which is Dreams of Eschaton, which the lyrics have this weird pulpishness to it. Every time I listen to it, it reminds me of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, with Ralph Bakshi's movie Wizards.
No, I'm not, no.
Nope, I'm familiar with Ralph Bakshi, but I haven't seen that movie. I think I've seen like clips from it, not clips, like stills and like movie posters and stuff, but that's about it.
Yeah. And for those listening, Ralph Bakshi was a famous animator who did a lot of kind of underground cartoons, most famously animated Fritz the Cat, which was the first X-rated cartoon movie. But then he did Wizards, which kind of led up to what he's also most famous for, which is doing that very first Lord of the Rings adaptation, which, some people hate.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, and some people love it for its, there's a lot of rotoscope used, which that's usually the thing people either love or hate. But right before that, he did Wizards, which, and I bring it up because that song, Dreams of Eschaton, always reminds me of it, because in Wizards, it's this premise of like nuclear war happens, which again is such an 80s thing. And in the nuclear fallout from that, a world of fantasy actually develops on the Earth. Like wizards and magic suddenly like appears on the Earth as life itself like regrows on the Earth. And there's certain lyrics in that song that just kind of bring that to mind. And also it has one of my favorite, if I can very quickly find it, favorite lines. Oh, that's right. I typed it in wrong. Okay. It says, "Before the gods of hell sends you to die, remember well, my friend, a warlord never cries." I mean, I just, again, and singing along to that, it's just, it's a lot of like the classic metal. It's having these lyrics that are accessible enough to sing along to, and it just gives you that feeling of transporting you from the mundane life into something like Lord of the Rings, something like these pulp novels of just, epic, good and evil and everything. And it's magic is the best I can say of it.
Yeah, Manilla Road was a bit of a blind spot for me. Like obviously I've been aware of them. They are everywhere at the moment. They seem to have really kind of got a retrospective popularity, as you mentioned, but I never really bothered with them, to the point where I might even withdraw my vote on this, because I did listen to it a couple of times in preparation for the episode, and my immediate impression was, as you say, like it's my kind of metal in that it's not trying to ingratiate itself to the listener. It's very kind of rough around the edges, and as you say, the vocals are an acquired taste. They're very nasally, but you can also sense that element of world building that you talked about, where they are trying to like invite the listener into a completely otherworldly kind of experience, but it has that kind of rough sheen around it. It's not a very slick or like big budget affair. But beyond that, I'm afraid I can't say too much else intelligent about it, other than I will definitely be checking more Manilla Road out from that era, because it's something I should have done a long time ago.
I'll say that, save for the end, the albums that came before it, like you can almost kind of think of it as their debut. It's not. There's like 2 albums before, but start from there and go forward with the later albums, and they'll be more closely related. And I will say, like, the production and some of the characteristics that are maybe a bit grating do smooth out a little bit. So there might be a later album that's easier to get into.
Tyler, any thoughts on Christ's sake, Manilla Road? I can't say that.
Yeah, this is unfortunate. I don't like Manilla Road. And I understand that I'm in a minority in that opinion, because there are many friends of mine in the extreme metal scene and heavy metal fans in general who love this band, and they have a very respected place amongst fans of underground heavy metal today, and I am not among their number. Especially this album, I feel so bad. Joseph, I just want you to know that I really respect your opinion. You're a cool guy. Don't hate me too much for this.
You can so hate this album. It's fine. Don't worry.
There's a lot of aspects of this album that almost remind me kind of melodically and in the energy and feel of an 80s aerobic video.
Okay, you're going hard.
And it just really doesn't. It's not my style. I can say that. I get why it's respected as much as it is, especially in spirit. It definitely has like that kind of underground DIY. Nothing about it is attempting to be professional. Is attempting to be just cool enough to kind of appeal to, I suppose you can say, normies, as well as people who are into niche, nerdy kind of things. And I admire that about any artist who does that, including Manilla Road. But musically, this album just does not grab me. To the extent that I don't know if my rating should be taken into consideration. We might just have to let Joseph rate this one, because I would... Well, I'll just be frank and put it on the table. I would probably give it a D rating, but you also have to consider my tastes. That I definitely lean a lot more hard into things that are very raw and not as happy as Crystal Logic can be at times.
I mean, it's funny you guys mentioned, like, with this and the Dio album, happy, and I get that. I do. I think again, it's that epicness. I think it's less sort of like happy in like a springtime, joyful, like Mamas and Papas song playing or something like that. And to me, that happiness is more sort of like the thrill of battle kind of thing. Or again, that like standing on your mountain, surveying your kingdom kind of thing. Like I mean, again, like the extreme metal connection, like I feel like at the heart of Winter Immortal onward, like this is where you get that, the Bathory Viking era, like especially the Dio Sabbath. I think it's that sort of, it's not happy in like the kind of happy I hate, which is like Death Heaven or something like that, in more that triumph of battle kind of thing.
Yeah, that's why I was using the word bright rather than happy, because it's undeniably brighter, but yeah, it's still heavy in the philosophical sense that Tyler mentioned. So, given that I'm sort of abstaining, Tyler's gone hard with the D. Would an A be fair or B?
I think I don't think the band's going to be too insulted. We can put it at a B, considering that just the lack of either exposure or Tyler, not really digging it. The one thing before we move on, I would say about Manilla Road as well as Cirith Ungol is that it's interesting with someone like Fenris from Darkthrone. I feel like so much of the lost and forgotten classics of the 80s, I've discovered because of Fenriz being such a fanboy and talking about that music. I know for absolute certain I discovered Manilla Road because either, I forget what it was, but one of the later 2000s albums, Dark Throne, literally mentions it in the lyrics, like, you were listening to something else and I was listening to Manilla Road. Like, and it's definitely that or Fenriz name dropping it that made me check out that band. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to see them a few times before Mark Shelton died. So the unfortunate thing is that Manilla Road is no more. But
Yeah, as an aside, I don't know if you would know this or not, but I believe isn't Mark Shelton from my neck of the woods over here in Kansas, like
Yes.
from the Wichita area?
He is. Manilla Road might be one, if not the most famous band to come out of Kansas, which is also part of the reason why they didn't get quite so big, because I think they've refused to try to move to the coasts.
Okay, so your next pick, Judas Priest, Defenders of the Faith.
Yes. I have, I have a pretty rose-tinted view on Priest in that I enjoy huge swaths of the discography with punctures of certain albums that I don't think are that great. Point of entry. But even that album, there's at least 3 songs that are really good, but the rest of the album's trash. But Defenders is probably in my top 4 of Priest albums alongside Painkiller, Stained Class, and Sad Wings of Destiny. And it's interesting because, most people of that era and that time of Priest would pick Screaming for Vengeance. And it's certainly, I think, the bigger album because of the singles on that album. But, kind of when we were talking about like Bright and Dark, I view those albums as siblings to each other. And Defenders of the Faith, I definitely feel is like the more nighttime album. Like, Screaming for Vengeance feels like an album to play in your car or when you're out and about during the day, and Defenders of the Faith is the one you play at night. There's just something very night-toned about it. And the other thing is there are a couple tracks on Screaming for Vengeance I would skip, and I don't think there's a single track on Defenders of the Faith that I would skip. I think it's pretty flawless of an album in terms of that 80s era for Priest. And in particular, I know probably my first exposure to it, well, actually my first was, I know I got like a Judas Priest compilation cassette tape was my first ever Priest, and it had Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. But then not long after that, I think being exposed to the music video for Free Will Burning, where the band are playing with laser lights going around, and then a bunch of kids are like nearly dying playing arcade games and headbanging in front of like old arcade sets. And to me, that's still just an amazing sort of association. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoy this album, and I definitely pick it over Screaming for Vengeance because of the darker tone in it.
I think I'm definitely team Screaming, because there are some tracks I'd skip on this album. But for me, it's all about 70s Priest. That run from Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, Stained Class is the foundation of a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of heavy metal, and they can't really be topped. And then, not to get sort of Hegelian on you, but yeah, they had a sort of a misfortunate kind of flirtation with pop and pop rock through British Steel and Point of Entry and Hellbent for Leather. I've done that in the wrong order, but never mind. And then they managed to synthesize the two sides of their like style with Screaming for Vengeance and Defenders of the Faith, in that they re-injected the heavy metal, and there's some really, really quality like just heavy metal riffs on here, some very, very creative solos, and Halford's vocals they can't be topped at this era, but also they're essentially pop songs, a lot of them, and they're very good pop songs at that. Well, some of them are. I would skip Love Bites on this album, I think, and a couple of others, but it's one of these where the first half comes out really, really strong. The second half, it does kind of tail off a little bit for me, whereas I think Screaming for Vengeance is sort of consistent throughout. And just on Halford's vocals as well, there's some footage from a British TV show called The Tube that was kind of one of the authentic competitors to Top of the Pops, where the bands had to play live, where there's a performance of Judas Priest just after they'd released this album, and it's in quite a small little venue, small studio, and there's no effects or anything, and it is just them playing much like a sort of very underground band, even though they were huge at the time. And Halford's vocals just bellowing out, and there's no effects on his voice whatsoever, and you really get the sense of the extent of his talent at that point. So yeah, there's a reason why he's kind of one of the most iconic vocalists in metal alongside Dio. But yeah, for me, this is the weaker sibling. I understand what you're saying in terms of the darkness to it, but yeah, I don't think I could rank it higher than a B, just because there are some stuff on here that I would tend to skip. But Tyler, what are your thoughts?
I really enjoy this album to a large extent. Judas Priest is one of those classic heavy metal bands that I have a lot of respect for their place in heavy metal history, although I have mixed feelings about their music objectively, I suppose you could say, in and of itself. There's definitely sometimes kind of mixed bag you get with their albums, with some albums obviously having moments of developing heavy metal towards away from like the kind of verse chorus like rhythmic chord strumming orientation of rock music prior to Judas Priest, towards something that's more heavily guitar centered and with more melodic development. But then you also get kind of a lot of just like classic pop hook kind of hit singles on their albums as well, like on Screaming for Vengeance, for instance. I'm honestly more along Joseph's lines of thinking with this album, and that I might enjoy this album more than Screaming for Vengeance. It's got some really cool moments on it that you can definitely hear its influence on the kind of neoclassical strain. I use that term with like a strong sense of air quotes of heavy metal that came after it. Like, these guys were kind of doing it first, and that's fairly impressive. Like one of the dual guitar solos on Free Will Burning really kind of set the stage for that style of guitar playing, and it can be an exciting and enjoyable record to listen to. Does it hit the level of profundity, at least as how I define it, that I enjoy in other heavy metal records, or especially in extreme metal? Not really, but they definitely had a huge influence on that strain of heavy metal, even if it's somewhat distantly through influencing artists that influenced those artists. So I would probably put this album at a B ranking.
Okay, that's 2 Bs.
Yep. three albums in a row in the Bs, but that's fine.
Well,
it's a taste thing. I mean, Shelley and I kind of somewhat more overlap in taste, and you clearly have a real big thing for classic heavy metal, which is cool. It's good stuff.
It's interesting because it sounds like, from what Shelley said, if I'd picked one of the 70s albums, it would have had a better chance of being higher. And the thing with Defenders is, like I said, like, it's amongst what I consider like my 4 favorite, which includes Sat Wings and Stained Class. And I guess you'd say I easily probably would have picked Stained Class as well, but I tried intentionally to not pick the quote-unquote proto-metal. And which is why I also didn't do like Rainbow Rising, because as much as I think that is such a pivotal album to metal trajectory, it is still in that chord of 70s. I mean, just as well I could pick some Scorpions albums from the 70s where it's so pivotal to what came later. Like, I think, like, if you want to know where Mercyful Fate comes from and King Diamond, you need to listen to 70s Scorpions. Like, it's there, along with Zeppelin and Priest. So that's the reason why I didn't include that. And as well, I thought Painkiller would be a little too obvious. So I went for Defenders.
Yeah, no, it's a quality pick. I do spin this album a lot, but yeah, just it's not my favorite Priest album, but yeah. But yeah, your next album though, Motorhead.
Yes, and this is the only one on the list that is a live album, which I wasn't quite sure if we should include it or not. But it's funny. Motorhead is one of the few bands where I feel like live it just takes everything to another level. I mean, a lot of bands, I think that's the case, but No Sleep Till Hammersmith, I think, is potentially the greatest live metal album of all time. It takes all the songs, the classics of Overkill, Bomber, and especially Ace of Spades, which had only come out, this was essentially the tour for Ace of Spades, and just rackets it up, like the loudness, the speed, everything's a little bit faster, the energy, the banter of Lemmy, I fucking love it. Like right before We Are the Road Crew, having one of the Road Crew guys come out and bellow into the mic is such a unique touch. And I think easily, because it's sort of a best of the band up to that point, it's certainly the easiest, I think, to get people introduced into Motorhead, because it's just got all the classics. I mean, it's good. The other thing too is, as great of an album as Overkill is, I think the production on that album leaves it a little less heavy than it could be. And then when you hear those songs, and there's a lot of them on this, it's like absolute steel hitting you in the face. Like, just a perfect live album.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the reason I allowed it is because obviously it's such an iconic live album. So I don't think I could really let's submit it. But yeah, it is basically the Motorhead at the height of their powers, the classic era, and as you say, like them just ramping up all of those songs to such an extreme, and it really does capture that the mayhem of the live setting for them. And Motorhead in general, especially at this time, they're kind of like the missing link that we've been dancing around, in terms of like, you have the more epic kind of fantasy-based metal, and then you have the raw, dirty streets like level punk side of metal that was evolving, and Motorhead kind of brought it all together, but kept that DNA of like the classic rock era from the 60s as well. And obviously there's not a band that followed in the 80s in the kind of metal rock milieu that doesn't cite them as an influence. And much like Discharge, you wouldn't have Metallica or Slayer or any of the sort of classics of thrash, and by extension you wouldn't have a lot of death metal, and yeah, into black metal as well, with sort of Venom and early Hellhammer, things like that. Their fingerprints are all over that, and they're kind of one of these great unifiers in that fans of classic rock love them, all metal kind of loves them, and punk absolutely loves them as well, and so they all come under the banner of Motorhead. And although their sound is very kind of basic and raw, you really do get the sense that there's a hidden complexity behind it, and that does come through on this live album as well. There's actually, there's some songs that do carry more of like a narrative kind of structure to them, that you kind of get a sort of hint of that here and there, and they're actually sort of, their diversity as musicians comes through. It's not just hard and heavy and fast constantly. There is like a depth and a feeling to Motorhead that makes their sort of formula very hard to replicate. And yeah, this album basically captures that moment from late 70s, early 80s perfectly. So yeah, I completely agree. Absolute classic. Tyler.
I think that a live album by Motorhead is the perfect album to pick. I prefer their live albums in many ways, because with their studio albums, you often get the effect where roughly half of the album or so will be really powerful, heavy, awesome anthems, and then you'll have another half of the album that is essentially Roadhouse blues. And I don't care for the Roadhouse blues side of Motorhead as much. Live albums, they often curate their playlist to be a lot of their better material. Not entirely, but more. They focus on those tracks more. And then they also play them, as Joseph said, with more energy, more speed, more power. So in that regard, I think this is a perfect pick for this band in particular. I'm a really big fan of their Everything Louder Than Everything Else live album because you also get the really good tracks from their later discography on that one. But this one is also an amazing album for the exact same reason. So Motorhead to me is, for all of the reasons that Shelley enumerated, and one of the best of the early period of heavy metal. They kind of stand on a league of their own with the power and energy that they put into their music, which may come in large parts from them having a foot in the world of punk rock as well. And they have this attitude that I think got passed on to almost all heavy metal after them in various ways, of a real fierce independence and self-sufficiency, which I think is very inspiring and comes across in much of their better music. I would rank this album as an A.
Oh, okay. I was going to say S, but what about you, Joseph?
I'm going to vote S.
Okay.
I am perfectly happy with that. It's a good album. I think that any self-respecting metalhead should own it.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome. So I don't have time to fully discuss Raphael's albums. So what I suggest we do is I'm just going to rank them, and then if I put something somewhere where you don't agree with, we can discuss it. Is that fair?
I definitely agree with that. Let's just do a quick group ranking of each of these.
Right. So we got that. That's.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Don't know about that one.
I would rank it lower, but I could understand putting it in an A.
Yeah.
The Blind Guardian is not for me, but I understand it's a very good example of what it is.
Well, while we're putting up, we should probably mention it to the audience, what we're putting up there. So, Mercyful...
Yeah, sorry, Melissa's gone into the S tier because it is a stunning album from start to finish, as is Break the Oath. Abigail, I've put in A. I might have ranked it lower, but again, it's more just because it's not for me. It's just an absolutely outrageous album.
Yeah. I mean, King Diamond's solo stuff is just...
I mean, the one thing I will say with Abigail, that was the first King Diamond album, even before Mercyful Fate I got, and yeah, it took me a while to get used to it, but that was one of the few albums when I was still not fully torn from the religious upbringing I had. So when I listened to that album, I actually thought I was listening to something like spiritually dangerous. And that album will always have a bit of joy in my heart for having done that for me. Yeah,
I mean, you don't even need to be religious to get that sense from King Diamond's vocals. They are utterly unique.
Yeah, they're a little bit, they could be a little bit on that kind of weird and spooky side. Blind Guardian, for me, it's they're not for me either. I would rank them above other power metal bands because I do think that they are popular for a reason. They know how to construct a good sense of melody, but they all are also, to me, kind of a one-trick pony. So
in their defense, I might be the biggest Blind Guardian fan here. I thoroughly enjoy it, and that is a particularly favorite album of mine from them. But I definitely can concede, just because of the taste that we have, that would be a B album. It's good. It's maybe the darkest album they ever made. The interesting thing with it, they went to, I forget his name, Rasmussen, the producer who did Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, and it kind of feels like an album that has that production kind of feel to it. So it's definitely an album I would kind of recommend if someone was into thrash and be like, oh, you should check out this from Blind Guardian.
Yeah, I didn't hate it. There's definitely moments on there that I really enjoyed, but much like the Abigail, it is a lot, and that style is just an acquired taste. I would almost argue more so than a lot of extreme metal, because there's a lot going on. There's a lot to unpack, but it's very distinctive, especially with the vocal style, and it's very dense as well. So yeah, next up, Iron Maiden, Peace of Mind. I know we've kind of already discussed Iron Maiden, and I think I know where Tyler's thoughts are on this album, but I quite like this album, so I'm gonna stick it as an A. But I think you both disagree with me, don't you?
It has one of my favorite songs, To Tame a Lion, which they don't play nearly enough live. But it does also have songs that I could care less for. And compared to Number of the Beast or Power Slave, I'd much more often pull either of those two albums than this one.
Oh, see, I'm the opposite. I think I prefer this to the two albums either side of it. But okay. And Tyler, you're not really a fan of this, are you?
No, not entirely. Is this the album with the Trooper on it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I will say that's the first song that I ever, or legitimate heavy metal song that I ever learned to play on guitar. So that's cool. Yeah, I would probably put this album as a C album. It's just not the period of Iron Maiden that I enjoy.
I'd put it as B.
Okay. Well, it's staying as a B then. And Iced Earth, Flat Earth, should I say? I'm going to put that in a C because it's kind of like.
I roughly agree with it. That I think
average thrash metal with really annoying vocals and power metal flourishes to it, which, as I've already said, I don't really like. So it's just kind of like an album I don't find that interesting and actively tries to annoy me, basically.
I was very partial. It's funny because Blind Guardian and Iced Earth were sort of the first metal bands I discovered outside of like the really big names like Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Metallica, Megadeth. And at that time, you know, when I was thinking, oh, what was a contemporary metal band, I was getting exposed to new metal because, again, late 90s, early 2000s. So hearing Blind Guardian, Iced Earth was sort of this like, oh my God, this is amazing. There are bands that still sound like what in my mind a metal band should sound like. And I think that's probably Iced Earth's best. Personally, just because that's a band that has not aged well for me, I would maybe put it at B, but if you guys want to put it at C, I'm fine with that.
Tyler?
Yeah, C works for me. I'm not a really big fan of this album. Like, just your run-of-the-mill speed metal chug riffing is something that I really kind of bores me after a while.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm glad we got one in the C tier anyway. Sorry, Raphael, but we did put Melissa in S tier. So yeah, thank you very much for joining, guys. It's been an exceptional discussion. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. Well, as Jason always mentions, check out the video on YouTube to see the tier list that we've created here. Let us know what you think in the comments. As always, be as honest as you like. But yeah, Joseph, it's been awesome having you back on. Great to get your input on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great hanging out with you guys again.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tyler, as always, absolute pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Really happy to have Joseph on for this one. I think this was a good episode to get his input on.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've definitely proved that it's not all pizza thrash. So if you're still listening, Jason, I hope you're encouraged to maybe check these albums out again. Yeah, and thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.